aghast that people could be coming to your door with the sanction of a religious organization who knows they are convicted child abusers. This has nothing to do with religious beliefs. This has everything to do with being responsible citizens in a community where there are children. And that's what this case was about. And that's what a successful case against Watchtower requires. There's been a lot of cases, and many of them have not been successful. They've been thrown out by the courts because they didn't meet certain threshold legal standards. For example, cases that are based upon family abuse, where the elders may have learned that a father or uncle or adult male is molesting a child in the family but have not intervened. That's probably not going to get over the obstacles that the law places in the path of a case of childhood sexual abuse in an institutional setting, because the control and the power of the elders in that situation is limited. Now, we do have, in this era, mandatory reporting of child sex abuse. And elders, as the clergy of Jehovah's Witnesses now, are legally required to report reasonable suspicion of childhood sexual abuse to Child Protective Services or law enforcement. Whether they meet that standard in any individual case, that's a different question. But that's the legal requirement. Now, that law was not in place when Candace was abused. And the family that she refers to that was abused by a family member, they didn't really have a case because it was a family situation. But they went to the elders for help, because that's what we see in the Jehovah's Witnesses. People go to the elders for help and for safety, because not only was Jonathan Kendrick a childhood sexual abuser, he was a violent man. He was a very sick man, and I would wager remains that way today, as a member in good standing of the congregation in Oakley, California. And when they went to the elders, Evelyn Kendrick told us in court that they went for safety. They wanted the elders to make them safe. And the elders did not do that. And in fact, they blamed Evelyn, just as Cynthia said. They said, well, if you had more sex with him, he wouldn't be doing that to your daughter. And they blamed the victim. And that is part of the institutional response that we have learned of in many, many, many people's own personal narratives. It has nothing to do with the case or the law or anything. That's the experience that we have heard from, Candace and I, from hundreds of people around the world since this verdict came public a month ago. I know that's not an isolated experience, but once Kendrick was known as a child sexual abuser and documented as that to New York, then they had an obligation to protect other kids, and that's what the judge found. And it would be no different if he was a swim coach. It would be no different if he was a parent in a small group of youth, or the soccer team. If he's going to be around kids, if he's going to be in activities with kids, then they have the control to be able to protect the kids, and it's up to them to figure out how to do it. Doesn't matter if they want to warn the congregation. Jonathan Kendrick has been criminally convicted of sexually molesting a child. They don't have to say who the victim was. They don't have to describe the abuse, but they have to warn. If they chose not to warn and to keep it secret, as they claimed their religious doctrine required, then they have to take some other method. Candace talked about they kept an eye on him. Well, they didn't keep an eye on him. Far from it. They never talked about him again after the first elders meeting in 1993, where they said, we're going to remove him. Elders left, new elders came in, never talked about it again. No one was assigned to monitor him or to keep an eye on him. So the testimony was, well, we all kept an eye on him, but what everyone on the jury understood is, if no one has that responsibility, and if everyone is keeping an eye on him, then nobody was keeping an eye on him. There's a thing that we learned about called theocratic warfare, where Bill Bowen from Silent Lambs likes to talk about this a lot, that it's okay to lie in the service of God. That's a higher goal than the secular. And that's another thing, that we don't litigate that beliefs in our court. No one mentioned theocratic warfare. No one mentioned any of that. It has nothing to do with the case. And we were asked, well, if you can't bring up that it's okay to lie, then how can you possibly show that they're lying? And the answer is very simple. It's the same in any case. A good lawyer does cross-examination, and a good cross-examination reveals a liar. Because it's tough to lie in court when you're going to be questioned about what you say. And so I didn't feel it was necessary to prove anything about theocratic warfare. I just need to prove that they were lying. And fortunately, that was very easy, because they lied a lot and got caught a lot. And they lied and got caught contradicting each other, contradicting themselves, contradicting what other people who were no longer Jehovah's Witnesses said. And the jury understood that these folks were not telling them the truth. And so we don't have to argue about those things, or disfellowshipping. It's their decision whether to disfellowship someone or not. If they chose not to disfellowship them, that's their right. But if they're not going to disfellowship them, they're going to let them stay in the congregation, then they better pick some other alternative method to protect kids. Because if they don't, the law is going to say you're no different than the swim club. You're no different than the Catholic Church. You're no different than any organization, secular or religious, in our society. The most important part of the case involved really three things. This was in the course of activities. Candace was abused during field service. Kendrick would take her to his house. So it happened during a church activity. Number two, it was not a family member. It was a known sexual abuser of children in the congregation. And number three, they had actual documented notice. The backdrop of all of it was a body of elder letter sent out in 1989 that required a policy of secrecy to allegations of childhood sexual abuse. And that's why they didn't tell anybody, and that's what the case was really about, and that's what Candace wanted to talk about before she ever came to a lawyer. You got to change the policy that lets these people hide who they are. And that was written in one of the letters that the elders wrote before Candace ever went to a lawyer. One of the elders wrote a letter and said, Candace wants the policy changed so that people who have already abused a child cannot abuse other victims. What's to prevent them from hiding who they are? Is what she said. They wrote it down. It was a great exhibit, a piece of evidence. Because if they keep it quiet, what's to prevent them from hiding who they are and getting other victims? The dispute was whether that policy really was what we claimed it was, a policy of secrecy, or whether it was just a garden variety body of elder letter with just standard instructions that were no different than anything else.